Welcome everyone to day one of the Slop Conference and the first panel. I'm Nirath. I'm the founder of Belongg and Sincerity, a former partner at Dalberg, and really looking forward to the discussions we'll have over the next 3 days. Over the last 2 years, Gen AI has really been a dramatic entry into the discourse. There have been new foundation models by leading companies, open source models, and apps that have been built on top of these models. And while all of these models and agents and tools have brought many advantages, they've also endowed humans with the capability of creating endless streams of serious sounding artifacts. Could be op-eds, proposals, research papers, cover letters that sometimes don't have any correlation with the lived experience, the expertise, or even deep passion or interest of the person who creates those artifacts through AI tools. This is now starting to be called the AI slop problem and is affecting all parts of society and is likely to get much worse before it gets better. In fact, Merriam-Webster, they put slop as the 2025 word of the year. Belongg, which is a social innovation venture focused on inclusion, and Sincerity, which is a recently launched blockchain-based proof of intention platform that is seeking to center human authenticity in different settings, including fundraising, research, thought leadership. We've curated this SLOP conference because we feel it's very important to discuss the AI SLOP problem from multiple different vantage points. And like I'd shared, over the next 3 days, we have about 13 sessions with 40 speakers talking about different parts of this puzzle. This session is the kickoff for the conference. It's called The Brief History of Slop, from the Sophists to the Algorithm. This session will set the intellectual foundation for everything that follows by asking a very simple question. Is the current crisis of AI-generated empty content fundamentally new, or is it just the latest version of what is a deep-rooted human tendency? The panel that we've managed to curate is absolutely stellar, and they bring very distinctive lenses to this issue: philosophy, linguistics, fieldwork linguistics, cultural commentary. And over the next 90 minutes, our goal is to have a rich kind of historical view, but also a conceptual view of the AI slop problem and why does it matter, what we might do about it. The way this, I'll come to the introductions in just a second, but the format of this is about 10 minutes for the introductions, which is where we are right now. Then there'll be about 70 minutes of actual discussion centered around 6 or 7 themes that we'll explore with all of the panelists coming in and talking about that theme from their vantage point. And towards the end, we'll have about 10 minutes of audience Q&A. So I'll first begin by introducing the panelists. First of all, we have Sundar Sarukai, who's a philosopher and has been a professor of philosophy at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, the founder director of the Manipal Center for Philosophy and Humanities, and also visiting faculty at Center for Social Society and Policy at IISc. He trained as a theoretical physicist before turning to epistemology. His books, Translating the World, The Cracked Mirror, and Experience Cast and the Everyday Social, both with Gopal Guru, explore how knowledge is shaped by language, by embodiment, and social location. He also runs Barefoot Philosophers, bringing philosophy to children and rural communities in vernacular languages. Next, we have Santosh Desai, who's the CEO of Future Brands and one of India's most widely read cultural commentators through his column City City Bang Bang, which has been running for 2 decades. He's written about these issues prolifically, and his latest book, Memes for Mamiji, examines how the smartphone has amplified Indian society's deep cultural patterns of performance, family, and social display. Welcome, Santosh. Then we have Peggy Mohan, who's a Trinidad-born linguist whose PhD documented dying Bhojpuri amongst the last generation of indentured laborers' descendants. She's written 2 books which are very relevant, and a third book which is coming out later this year. The first one, Wanderers, Kings, and Merchants, retells Indian history through the lens of how languages form, how languages flatten, and how they get rebuilt through migration and power. And then her sequel, Father Tongue Motherland, from last year, reconstructs a vanished pre-Sanskritic language of the Indus Valley. Welcome, Peggy. We'll also be joined by Rukmini. I'll introduce her and hopefully we'll have her join the panel soon. The fourth panelist, Rukmini Bhaya Nair, is Professor Emerita of Linguistics and English at IIT Delhi, and a global professorial fellow at the Queen Mary University of London. She's a Cambridge trained linguist, cognitive scientist, and poet. And her latest book, Deception, Mind, Metaphor, Memes, and Mimicry Machines by Bloomsbury, traces the continuum from human lives to AI generated language. And her four poetry collections each respond to moments of national crisis. So it'll be a very exciting discussion between the four panelists. I'll now sort of begin with just a couple of minutes of context setting, and then we'll turn to the questions. So the context which I touched upon in the opening, humans have always sort of created different kinds of artifacts and content that are not sincere and that are not backstopped by any deep passion, knowledge, or lived experience. This has been done for personal financial incentives. For instance, sophists who charge fees to teach Athenians how to win arguments regardless of the truth in that argument. This has happened also for political domination, where colonial rulers imposed simplified languages on the subjects. This has happened because of the mechanics of capitalism, where financial models lead to meme videos and infinite scrolls on social media apps that to maximize attention capture. But something has changed because of Gen AI, which sort of became mainstream about 2 years ago. It has now become very, very easy to create artifacts which have superficial polish at a scale that has never been seen before. Users can use AI models to generate polished applications, essays, research papers, opinion pieces, white papers, proposals, and this in a way that removes all the effort and the lived experience that once was a good marker for genuine commitment and was able to distinguish it from empty performance. The correlation has now broken down, and it's sort of affecting all spheres of society. Organizations we've spoken to in, let's say, hiring or fundraising, they're saying that about 80% of all the applications they get now are AI generated, and it really is causing a huge amount of burden to assessment processes, which are very vital for a well-functioning society. Everyone's kind of drowning in slop. So pre-generative AI, the effort required to produce quality materials used to be a signal in itself, and this was a scarce binding constraint. For instance, writing a strong application to a certain program required genuine understanding. Conducting original research required time and domain knowledge. But AI is collapsing these kind of cost structures, these time structures, and the correlation, like I said, of the quality of what someone produces through AI and the quality of their actual understanding, that correlation has broken down. In this panel, we want to sort of go back, zoom out, and almost trace the roots of slop and see how we've come to this. Whether what we're experiencing is just a slightly different version of what always was there, or is this something significantly and structurally new? Uh, who is getting most affected, and what might actually work as a response? So that's the questions that we'll explore. Let me, with that context, jump into the first question. This I'll pose to all the panelists, and then I invite you to sort of jump in with your responses based on your background. The first is, what is slop, and why should we care? In my intro, I said we use slop to describe communication that looks like it has substance, but it doesn't, which could be like a padded resume, a memo. Right now, we're seeing a lot of stuff on LinkedIn, which is so-called thought leadership, but actually it's nothing, it's saying nothing. And How would you define this phenomena? Where do you see it showing up in your daily life? And why do you think we should care about this? So let's start with Sundar. So Sundar, you've sort of, in translating the world, you have argued that all knowledge involves translating experience into language, and that rhetoric and performance are basically part of how we understand things and not separate from it. So if all knowledge has some degree of performance, what is that line where it still constitutes genuine understanding, and where does emptiness that we're calling kind of slop start? So let's start with you, Sundar, on that.
Thank you, Nirath. It's lovely to be part of this panel, and I think you've raised some very important questions. And let me give a couple of quick responses to it. The first point is to ask whether this is a problem which is comparatively new and that we are learning how to deal with it. So, as we've already seen when I teach, and I used to give these end-term assignments for students to write, and within the last couple of years, we have discovered, in another institution where I taught, I had such wonderful answers in the final assignment And I graded them very well until I was told by the TA that they were 50% and above were done by AI. And that was my first introduction to how students can actually do these kinds of things. But then the response to it, just like your response to it in terms of an awareness of slop, is to say, how do we beginning to detect the surface varnish, and how do you go back to coming up with some kind of ways of dealing with it? So, for example, one of the ways is to say we don't give them the kind of questions we would give them earlier. I've also tried asking people to write now, in more traditional forms, not as a exam, but actually do it with pen and paper and then submit if the institution wants evaluation and so on. But and the reason why I'm saying this is because for me, looking at the history of knowledge and the sociology of knowledge, the slop phenomena doesn't seem to be anything new at all. And let me give you a different context, because you did point out that you're looking at knowledge which is generated from passion and deeper search, etc., and trying to use that as a framework to contrast with what you call as slop, but low quality AI generated content. If I just to give you a framework for this, if you look at the number of research papers published in academics today, today it's about 6 million a year. It is, we have good data till 2022, and it's about 5 plus million, and it's increasing about 5 to 6% every year, which means you are producing an enormous amount of papers, and these are just published papers. So PubMed, which has people putting in their research papers, uploading it before reviewing and publication, they upload about 2 papers a minute, a million papers a year, a few years back. So all these have gone up enormously. People don't have time to read all the papers which are being published. So this raised a very important point about what is this knowledge being produced, and is it even being read? In fact, there is something which used to be called an urban myth that 90% of published papers are never read and never cited. Okay, and see, citation is a measure of how many people have read and talked about it, right? And people have responded to this. It's a urban myth and so on. But there was a blog in LSE which points out that in humanities, 82% are not cited at all. 82% of all publications. We're really talking about the fact there's a huge amount of unread, produced commodities which are lying around in the name of knowledge gain in modern academic practice. Now, the question is, does this make this the same as slop? I don't think so. There are different kinds of things. But what both of them point out to is that the fundamental drive which has produced this is the idea of excess. And it is actually about modes of production, nothing else. Just as much as the kinds of pre-modern technologies to pre-modern science and technology becomes modern science and technology, one of the greatest change in that is the change of scale. It is not that people are not doing various kinds of technologies, but the scale, the factory model, and then the industrialized model, etc., comes in. It is also at the same time that modern establishments of institutions of technology and science also happen, and where knowledge also becomes a kind of a factory produced product. And therefore, the enormous one, as I said, one might say, well, actually all this knowledge in the sciences and tech, or in academics in general, are being driven by something else, by a passion to know, etc., etc. But if you really look at it, it may be true. I do think mostly it's true, to take it very seriously. But there are also a large number of growing amount of publications in these fields, in these knowledge domains, which are being driven by other kinds of interests and very little to do with passion and knowledge about the world, etc. We know, for example, I would say nearly 30, 35, one third of all funding is coming from defense, and now increasingly more from private companies like pharma, AI, and the other in the chemical industries and so on. So if we look at that as a fundamental question, then what should I do to engage with the question of slop? One, I begin to ask questions about what does social production really mean? What are we producing? Who are we producing? And most important, who is running this job of production? Who is running our factories of production? When I mean factories, here across all many of these domains, right? So, in a sense, I want to go back to the point you raised. Is this an expansion of human tendency of producing these kinds of things, or is it reflective of some particular kind of a social formation about how one understands what the function of a society is, what the function of citizens in a society is, and so on? One could also say that there are similar examples of literature, and I'll just stop here at this point, that there is a very large number of books which are published in literature and in art. But I do think the comparison between art production, for example, in terms of artworks, which still seem to have resisted this larger idea of slop in various ways, in terms of certain kinds of passion and engagement with certain kinds of things. It's done it not because of any maybe part of their own internal reflection, but also because of the fact that the modes of production of art have not entered into this kind of a cycle that's science and technology have become. Because we can remember that modern science and technology, it's impossible to distinguish them from formation of capitalism, and it is only that enterprise which actually runs science and technology today, not our search for the stars. And therefore, the final point I'm leaving here is this: the real question is, how do we think about the problem of excess and excess generation, excess usage, etc. And looking at intention alone may not be helpful, but we need to fine tune it. I'm sure others can add various parts about how to fine tune this point. There is excess production, but you could say there is a kind of intentional question could be distinguishable. But that's something which we need to really look at a little more seriously.
Yeah. No, thanks, Sundar. I really like the way you've sort of gone almost upstream to the incentives that lead to the creation of knowledge to begin with, the defense kind of model, the capitalism, which leads to science and tech, and also how historically there has been organic kind of lots of production, and maybe the marginal utility of that sixth million research paper is near zero, right? Because it's and but what's happened is that there's structural kind of the production mechanism has changed, but you're saying that some of those characteristics still continue. So we'll definitely come back to this because there's something about the human kind of intention, the person who actually creates it, that we do want to double click
Yeah.
a little bit more on, and maybe I'll use that to bring in Rukmini. Hi, Rukmini, welcome. Morning. So you let's start with your work, right? So in Deception, you've talked about this continuum, lies, metaphor, performance, and in your opinion, where does slop, the way we've kind of framed it, sit on the spectrum? Is it closer to the lie, where the liar or the creator of that slop is at least know what the truth is and knows the fact that they're deviating from truth? Or is the AI slop right now, the process, somewhat more mechanical, which is not even deception? It's something else entirely. And how would you place this in your spectrum? And do you think there's something structurally different between how it's happening right now versus how it was happening, let's say, even just 3 or 4 years ago, pre Gen AI?
Thank you for the question. And when you speak about this spectrum that I have, I should perhaps explain what I mean by the spectrum. So I basically mean in my work that the lie is a cousin of the truth. So, and we are not really always have all these rhetorical devices, hyperbole, metaphor, and whatnot, in order to come to grips with the world. So the spectrum is not so, I mean, it is important in my work, but what I would like to emphasize is not so much how important the spectrum is, but to focus in on the question which you asked, which is where does slop fit in on this spectrum? That's what you asked. Now, I think that the problem that the nature of slop is that it doesn't sit still, and it is slop. So it slops and it flops. And I want to, and flops are also very important as part of the design features of language, which I'll get into, AI flops. But anyway, so because it is the nature of slop to slop. And I agree with Sundar that this is not a new phenomenon. I believe that it is encoded into the human mind, into the way we evolved evolutionarily. So I want to now bring it down. I mean, I recognize the importance of current overproduction, of the models of extractive production and so on and so forth. But to move it away from this, as a cognitive scientist, I want to ask some basic questions. The basic question, and I will bring this down to a level which uses metaphor, which is one of the things you mentioned. And I want to use a concrete device for this. The concrete device I want to use is a cup. Okay, this one says chai, and in Hindi, in the Hindi script, and chai, of course, contains the word AI. Now, if you look at this, you can say that the thing which happens, I haven't filled this cup because I'm too afraid of damaging my computer. But you know what happens with slop is that if this cup is overfull, the slop will slop over. And this is a physical lived experience of slop. We can think of many ways of thinking about this problem. For example, we can ask, what are the ways to mop up slop? What are the ways? And this is, so we can have cover on top of this cup. We can, fill the cup less. We can have all sorts of patch-up devices in order to reduce AI slop. So this is the first stage, and we have patches and so on in AI models. But the next stage will be not to ask, how do I mop up stuff which spills over, which is a technical and rather boring question, but what's inside the cup? That is second, stage 2. And we may say, when I want to look inside this cup, what I find is it contains all sorts of things that I didn't want. For example, an AI cup is full of apps. So if I want to know what's in my bank account, for example, I will have to go through all these apps which tell me I should play Candy Crush. These are the games which is on the way. This is what. So all these apps actually impede my progress. So that's a form of slop. And you can ask what's in the cup. But to me, it's not the what's in the cup question, which is that interesting, because at this stage you may decide, I want to put aside this cup. I don't want to have anything to do with AI. Or I'm, I agree these apps and so on are slops, AI slop, but I'm addicted to them. I'm stimulated by them. So I will keep the apps. So you can make various decisions as an individual on this. The third stage is what interests me as a cognitive scientist. And it is not the question of how do I mop up stuff? How do I, decide what's in the cup? But what is the relationship between a concept like AI slop, which is just a piece of language, and what does it tell me about myself, the mind, how I process a piece of language like AI slop? It's just a linguistic artifact, which is a word you've used. What does it tell me? And then I find that this question has been asked for hundreds of years. It's been asked in the Kena Upanishad, like Kenishatam patita preshatam mana kena prana pratama prati yuktaha. Kena vacha imam vyadanti. Where do words come from? How do we see? What does it mean to ask questions? Now, the Upanishads, Kena, is not really that old a text, but it is a text which asks these questions today. Russell might say, what is matter? Never mind. What is mind? No matter. In all these cases, we are playing around with the concept of what the mind is, how it processes language. And that part, it brings me to the final, to maybe the final point I want to make at this stage, which is that natural languages are infinitely sloppy, and they have been framed by evolution to be sloppy. And why? Because they enable us to be flexible. Because we have very small, we use very little power, and that flexibility enables us to adapt to the world around us. So then we begin to ask, well, what's the difference between this? Why is this not a cup? Because it has a lip. We keep going back to the question of what is a cup? Why is this not a cup? But why is this a cup, even if its handle is broken? When we ask those questions, we notice that we grope for words in order to get this phenomenon right. We never get it right. That's why we have conversation. That's why we have narrative. And finally, I want to end this part with an idea which is to do with how we dance around a piece of language. And let's look at the way in which repair mechanisms are built into, whether we are addressing questions of caste or anything else. We constantly make mistakes, and this is part of language, this is part of vision, this is part of every modality that we have. So we must take on board that we have slop because it's flexible. And if you take any word like chat GPT, most people won't know what GPT stands for. Do you? You know what it stands for. So it stands for something like generative pre-trained transformers. If we said something like that, people would be put off forever. So we don't say that. We just shorten it to GPT. And this is a form of commonplace acronymization of commonplace modern slop. If we end with the notion of the word cognition, what we find is cognition comes from the word nomon. And nomon means to calculate an abstract idea like time or mind, which we cannot see. Nomon means sundial. And so you have a pole, a shadow on the ground, and the sun. And from this, you infer something like time, which we cannot see, touch, hear, etc. And of course, we grope for the answer here. This is why we need continual conversations. This is why we need inference. And this is why we must sort of look at the fact that natural language is full of fractures, breaks, sloppiness, and we have our conversations in order to create communities that can address this problem of evolutionary slop.
Yeah.
That's
Rukmini, thanks for actually that super rich kind of thing. And there's a bunch of questions that I was thinking of. If you look at the roots of slop, right? So I was looking up the roots of slop, the word slop, the old English roots, and even the metaphors that you've used about it. It doesn't sit still; it's flop, it flows, and how natural language has the sloppiness. I think something I want to get to maybe towards the second half of this conversation with everyone is we've got this tendency historically pre-AI that slop is stuff which is actually lazy, which is clumsy, which is an argument not fully formed, right? But now I think what's happening is with AI, arguments are being very nicely formed, right? And they're over precise. So like James C. Scott, etc., would say in like when you're trying to impose legibility upon a certain situation, which is too soon, right? You are sort of avoiding this messy middle, which is where a lot of sense making happens. So I want to come to that a little bit and how maybe we need to expand that definition of slop. But the way you've talked about languages is actually a very perfect segue to bring Peggy in. Peggy, you've said that obviously you've worked a lot on languages, the birth of language, the evolution of language, the death of language. You've said that storytelling produces super rich language, whereas transactional interactions strip language to bare function. and also how migration produces pigeons and which are for transactions. And then one could imagine that right now we are in the middle of a mass migration to AI land. And let's say if you think about things like prompts, right? The prompts that we use to chat with AI, I mean, you could call them some sort of pigeons, right? So do you think that as we are optimizing for this transactional efficiency, when let's say a researcher is using AI to create a research paper or somebody is doing it, do you think it's landing naturally in to a flattened version of output, which can be called slop, or is it different from slop? What do you think?
Okay, let's see if I can take you from the question you asked, which is going to come out of some stuff that I came up with writing my next book, which is coming out in September. Taking off from what Rukmini just said about how much slop is there in natural language, right now I'm not doing exactly natural language. I'm doing a very edited version in real time, trying to create something like a text which looks like what could have been written. Imagine how much editing is happening in my head, not to show you the hiccups while I do that, not to have the throw-out versions where I reject that sentence and go on. There is something in my next book which talks about something called meeting speak, which where we create the illusion of smoothness and meaning and importance, when in fact, in normal natural speech, as opposed to writing, we don't get to edit. And therefore, we have to pretend that this is what natural speech looks like without the mistakes, without the false starts, which is something that I was able to look at, for example, in confessions, which I had to analyze. If there are no false starts, we're not talking of natural speech. We're talking of either something that looks like text, written text, or meeting speak, which is another thing again. I like to go back to the root whenever I find out that there's a problem, like, as you say, slop. Um, where did our AI universe in India come from? Uh, we keep thinking that AI goes back in the West to the Alan Turing need to create something that appears. See, I'm giving you hiccups while I talk to show you. All the slop is being edited out as I talk. So Alan Turing had a particular objective, which was to make the thing look as human as possible. China came up with its own different objectives, and hence we got a very fast track move towards what emerged as DeepSeek in about 2 years' time. What we find here is something quite different, and I am concerned with India in particular because we are at a very formative stage of making up our AI universe. And I find that it's not very clear to me that in a larger sense, we know why we're doing it. We are doing it because we're basically tail wagging along with the West, and the last AI conference pretty much shows it that we're quite thrilled to be of use to the West. And where have our objectives been? So naturally, you're going to find that we've built something very ingenious that is not very similar in its overarching quality to China. It doesn't have clear objectives, civilizational objectives, as the next stage of linguistic connection. And it obviously does another thing that I find quite alarming, is that it leaves out 98% of the society. I'm using that figure. There's just been a study, a little bit more credible than what I would come out with at the top of my head, that only in Delhi, among students aged 14 to 21 years, only 2% say they speak English at home. So we're talking of an entire universe of techies and of ideas built around 2%. Is there a problem? Rukmini just raised a hand.
Sorry, no, I didn't.
No. Okay, I'll just go
I
on.
apologize. This is
Okay.
natural language.
Okay, yeah. That we've built an entire universe around a 2% of the population, which is very different from what China has done, what other countries have done. So, where are those others? If you're going to have um, a language model that is essentially catering to 2% of the population, sees itself as ultimately linked to AI in the West, and therefore ancillary to AI in the West. It's just pulling up what I would call, instead of diving deep into the ocean of who we are and serving as a next level language connector, which addresses multilingualism in an ingenious way, say the way the Chinese were able to, with their characters, create a homogeneity in written space. We have the option to do that using AI and create a connection in written space, which could extend later. We haven't done that. Instead of what I say, diving deep into that huge ocean, which is not India only, the South Asian linguistic universe, all of Pakistan follows the grid of what our language typology is, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and all of India in the languages that are usually written. We have not sought to connect those to a next level. Instead, we have stayed on what I call the zone of seashore slop. So, by definition, our AI initiative in India is based on what looks cute and what we can quickly get into without having to deal with much larger civilizational questions of who we are, what we want to do, what it's going to do for us. We have just been looking at little things here and there, some of them important, that help, that are interesting to do, fun for coders. There isn't that overarching feeling that one gets with China, and that has emerged in some way in the West, although we must remember that a lot of Western AI is funded by militarism and surveillance and things like that, which are not our, I hope, objectives. I was looking at something that Gemini has said. Gemini, of course, tries to sum up the situation. Where is India? Where is China? Where is the West? They also add in Japan, where China seems to be about long-termism and collective mobilization. So there's a huge overarching picture of what they want to do. And they will obviously have their own slop. Maybe it's tolerable. Maybe your language has a certain amount of slop. We just, because we see written language and we hear discourse like what we are doing here right now, we have the illusion that it's fairly free of slop. It's not. We've edited it out while we've been talking. It could very well be there. However, Gemini has a very interesting take on how India has approached the whole AI issue. And one is that they prioritize the word jugaad. It's interesting to see, well, a lot of their people are Indian, but jugaad as agility, finding low cost solutions under constraints, chaotic growth, scarce resources, a genius for making it work, comfort with ambiguity, iterative hustle, flexibility as the only way to survive. Now, it's interesting. It's basically talking about skirting around a larger entity, which is not really your own. The only thing is that a lot of the workers in it are your own. So you have not imagined this thing in terms of what it's doing for you, or India as 100% of the population, but only the 2%, which is happy to base all its coding, all its translation is going to be into English, out of English. I mean, AI in India has not gone into languages talking to each other and building something that could perhaps project a different India, which I think is coming into being. In the last few years, there has been a change. The little facile interest in jugaad and coders at the center of it all has begun to change because I've noticed that there's a huge impulse towards translation, translated material, as a large number of quite ingenious, bright people who don't feel comfortable in English, may not know English at all. I said, we want to be part of the discussion. We need to find out what you are talking about. Podcasts are the easiest, but they want written translation of a lot of material in economics, linguistics. I go to meetings and find people who have only read my books in their own languages coming and asking me questions about some technical point in linguistics. Usually it is that, not about data. So if in the last few years we're getting this whole stripe, this whole cohort of India that fills our airports, which were never so full before, which fills our superhighways into Sonipat and Panipat at 9 o'clock at night, 5 + 5 lanes, we're getting a new cohort of India on the move. And perhaps the definition given by Gemini about what Indian thinking, Indian civilizational ethos are, basically Jugaad, is not eternal. Something is changing and we've not addressed it. So we're skirting on the shores, and therefore we will notice in particular all the slop because it's not contextualized as the side slop. It is very much mixed in with the output of AI in India, which has not been focused towards who we are, what we want, because that's also a political question. We haven't yet transited from the kind of society that we have been in the past, where at one time Sanskrit was known by the elite, at one time Prakrit or Persian, and now English. And to move to the sort of society where, like in China, 900 million internet users exist. We don't even have good interfaces for using our local languages with AI. I have a belief that a lot of things will change as these people become active and something decolonizes about the way we think about language and AI. We haven't got there yet. It may not happen in my lifetime or generation, but I see signs that it's coming, that there are a lot of players who are not as conservative, as risk averse, who would prefer to see something more focused, in which the slop will take the place, as Rukmini said, of the normal slop in
Yeah, yeah.
human language. And we would have a larger sense of where this thing is headed, where we fit into it, and what it's for. Think about that.
Uh, uh, Thanks, Peggy. I think the piece about how it's really a function of context, how India might actually how it's a very centralized technology, and how the production of slop right now, because it doesn't have enough context, it seems artificially smooth. That's actually, Santosh, I'll turn to you. And this is an important kind of piece, right? So, in your book, in your recent book, you've argued that the smartphone has really amplified the inherent tendency in Indian society to perform and to display and socially signal. But the phone now enables you to continuously do that in a very banal kind of a way. Uh, if you were to think, and phones, of course, and the social signaling and these 1 minute videos, memes, continuous performance, this has been there at least for the last 7, 8 years, ever since the phones and the internet have been high bandwidth. Have you seen anything change in the last 2 years, right? As generative AI is now making it super easy for people to perform and project, but those artifacts are now AI generated. Are you seeing anything different? Are you seeing this to be more of a continuation of what was there even, let's say, 4 years ago?
Yeah, so let me focus, in an overall sense on I think it has been argued, and I think argued from a variety of very, very rich and diverse perspectives as to how slop has been an inherent part of our experience through the beginning of time. I mean, in the sense that has always been a part of language. It has been a part of how we've kind of, so slop by itself is not new. I think what I would argue is that what it has done is fundamentally, and I do think it has fundamentally changed the landscape purely through scale. Because I think, up to a point when slop was either inherent in language or in certain, as Sundar pointed out, in terms of, let's say, an area like research publications where you have an enormous amount of slop. And certainly the grand central of slop is LinkedIn, where, or business conversations, so business conferences, uh, to which I have been to an unfortunately large number. So I mean, I can speak about the slop there. So I think that has always existed. But I do think that when knowledge production becomes such a performance that is accessible to all, I think that fundamentally changes things. And I think then the question arises as to whether what is being produced is at all knowledge, or it is simply the act of being able to produce something that looks like knowledge. And therefore I do think that is the question now, that which is, if the knowledge production becomes an ability that is, not only universally or at least widely available and has clear social rewards, then therefore there is a strong incentive to produce knowledge, things that look like knowledge. And I think that's what we are seeing, that actually to equate production of either writing or speech as being constitutive of knowledge, I think itself, I think there is a schism there, that is not an automatic kind of a translation. And I think that's important, because I don't think the intention is knowledge production. The intention is self production in a sense. So I do think that it becomes important to look at what this facility enables in terms of how its social uses that it is put to. So to my mind, that is a big sort of a question there. The other thing that comes to mind, which I think what slop has done, is to the evaluation that is implicit in the use of language. Again, Sundar talked about the fact that for it has become much more difficult to evaluate students, for instance, in a very specific sense, because of the fact that you cannot make out what they have actually learned versus what they have picked up from AI. But in a more fundamental sense, we've always used language and its deployment as a sign of being able to evaluate somebody and bracket somebody in a certain slot. And when that becomes widely accessible to everybody, that ability to use language as a mechanism for evaluation, I think itself gets severely compromised. And I think that also creates disorientation. I mean, very specifically, of course, in the academic function when you are evaluating students, because that is important. But even in terms of social discourse, when implicitly we are judging and bracketing people based on their deployment and use of language, that becomes much more difficult to navigate. So I do think that what it creates is in an overall sense. And so to come back to the question that you asked, whether there has been a significant difference in the last 2 years, I do think there has. I think there is a significant difference in the sense that we find that ourselves lost, I think, in an epistemic field, in a sense, which is where the markers are less clear. And therefore, one could argue that in fact the answer to this in some form might come from AI itself. And in fact, it will. I mean, I would be very surprised if you didn't have a slop, judging sort of a device that AI itself creates. So that we live in a world where AI slop is read by AI agents. And therefore, they have this little cozy twosome where there is that kind of a closed world, because I cannot see human beings kind of spending time trying to read all of this, but very easily AI can kind of sniff out something of value, if at all there is any. And to me, the more disquieting question is, right now there is this very cozy, easy kind of a assumption that what AI creates is slop, or we are able to classify it as slop, however we define it. What if it stops creating slop? What if actually creates something that is indistinguishable from, and you can argue that it does not have connection with lived human experience, and you can argue that it does not have the messiness and the hesitation and the hallmarks of all that counts as actually knowledge, the way that we acquire knowledge. We can argue all of that, but if in its final appearance it is indistinguishable from original human thought, which currently it is by no means, right? But if it is, what happens to our understanding? So to me, that really is the question that bothers me.
Yeah, and let me double click on that. Just yesterday, I was reading Terence Tao, the mathematician. He sort of used a metaphor. He's saying that look, AI is now leading us to mathematical theorems, and it's like a helicopter dropping into that place. Whereas earlier you would have to traverse terrain, right? And that journey would have been super interesting, and that's what leads to a lot of learning. But the question I want to sort of maybe double click on is you said, I mean, I love the phrase of LinkedIn be the grand central of slop. Have you seen any? Do you think I'm right when I say that, let's say 3 years ago, there was literally no incentive for business professionals to create a lot of slop on LinkedIn because the marginal cost was very high. And like and right now the marginal cost of producing that LinkedIn post is near zero. And you've also said that the intention is not knowledge production, it's just production. So what do you think is the difference between somebody who's posting on LinkedIn as a professional versus and it's sloppy, and versus the housewife or this teenager who's posting on Instagram? What do you think is the motivational difference between those two? And has that changed?
So I guess at a certain level, there is a common motivation, which is, of course, self-presentation. I mean, but I do think that the housewife who posts on Instagram does so out of a lived experience. And to that extent, I think there is a significant difference. Particularly right now, I mean, the profusion of content feels sloppy. And right now, and AI has not yet. It is. I mean, it will change in 6 months. But right now, the majority of content on Instagram is not AI generated, whereas increasingly on LinkedIn it is. So I mean, just for the basic differences. But I do think that I think that given the fact that the ability to produce video storytelling, I mean, video storytelling is a new form. It was not accessible to people before. So I do think that there is a certain naivete, a certain sloppiness, and a certain one can see the act of production. One can see it evolve. One can see the sort of the by day, bit by bit, how there is a certain language that is emerging there. So because that language was not a given, that language, unlike language or that is of business or language that written language has had a much longer sense of history and a sense, and it is codified much more sort of easily. So I think there is a different kind of a phenomenon that is playing out on LinkedIn, and a more inventive kind of an evolution that is taking place on Instagram, which I see them as being different. I'm not sure I can fully coherently kind of articulate that difference, but I certainly see a difference.
Okay, and let's double click on that. We've covered the second question I'd sent on the email, but maybe let's cover on question 3. This is an important one, at least for us. And this is to use Santosh and then to Rukmini and other Peggy and Sundar. Please feel free to jump in if you'd like to after Santosh and Rukmini have gone. So earlier, if you were to classify production, right, of these artifacts as on two dimensions. One is high value, so value and volume, right? So let's say a white paper which takes a year to write, that's high value. It can shape policy on the one hand for millions of people, and on the other side, you take like a 5-second meme video, right? So it's high volume and low value. It doesn't really matter. So right now, one of the things that we are noticing is that AI is making it super easy to create I mean, and Santosh, at least we are using professional models and like all of these top LLM models, and I think the difference between slop versus AI generated stuff, that's already disappearing for us at least. So the thesis is that AI now makes it very easy for people to create high value, low volume artifacts, and for those artifacts to have no link between real expertise, and for those things to flood these stakeholder market, right? So that, for instance, the report by a consulting firm in Australia, which was ultimately revealed to be sloppy. So what happens when you have this stuff happening? How do you sort of think about this problem where you have these very, very important decision-making settings where decision makers might now be exposed to artifacts that have been created by AI, by people who haven't actually understood that thing at all, right? And their ability to decipher whether it's AI generated or not is actually not very pronounced. There's a lot of research that shows that AI is actually right now not very good at making out what is generated by AI. So those AI tracking tools are not working very well. Uh, do you think that this is a risk, or how sort of should one even think about this?
Well, I think it raises a fundamental question that if people involved with that kind of decision making do not have the ability or are not able to recognize AI generated work from human generated work, then what is the value of human generated work? I think that is the question that is a natural question that gets asked, because if eventually the idea of that report is to be used, it is utilitarian. I mean, it is an input into a decision, and if the people who are tasked with making that decision cannot do not have the ability to tell the difference, then in a purely utilitarian sense, it kind of, in an instrumental sense, it works, right? The question therefore is the fact that fundamentally what our understanding of what expertise is about itself gets challenged. I mean, and what is the nature of expertise if expertise does not involve being able to tell whether something is produced in a way that accounts for reality, then of what use is that expertise? To me, I mean, the question that is asked is actually of saying that then why do we accord it the label of expertise if it is unable to do that?
Right, but Santosh, the question, so there's an asymmetry in those two people, right? Let's say the bureaucrat who's evaluating a certain proposal, that bureaucrat may not be the expert. They've sent an RFP just because they know that they're not the experts, and they've asked 5 experts to submit that, right? So, and those bureaucrats have bounded rationality. They only know so many things. So, the question then becomes, how important is human provenance, right? The fact that that idea originated in somebody's lived experience, in somebody's expertise. How important is that? And maybe I'll turn to Rukmini. You've talked about narrative mimicry, right? So where AI can copy human narratives and stories and even, let's say, such artifacts without lived experience, and you sort of analyze human AI dialogue, how LLMs reshape knowledge production. I want your take on like these artifacts are getting produced, but they have no human provenance. There's nothing backstopping that artifact. It's mimicking some human experience, but it actually is not, right? And so do you think about this in the way that Santosh is saying that look, can we think about this as a pure kind of objective function, utilitarian function, where if it gets the job done, then how does it matter, right? Or there's something deeper here, where ultimately one could argue that if you look at things like Kenneth Arrow's theorem, right, the impossibility theorem, it's impossible to sort out preferences in a society, right? So in that sense, having that messy process of negotiation, of knowing what humans actually want, even though that may not be a simple, clean answer, that becomes very important. So what's your take on this?
Well, this is a complex question. Let me try to go back to the point Santosh made, that, you generate stuff, and if it works like tools do, and we
So
are...
she'll have to.
Sorry? We are tool making. What I'm seeing on my screen now is the word "roit." I don't know what that means, but immediately I'm distracted and I want to interpret that word. So let me just go back to putting aside the question of the fact that I've just been distracted by the word ROIT appearing on my screen. I want to go back to the initial question, which Santosh asked, that, if something has utility, we use it. And this is because we are addicted to tool making, and we are tool using animals. But I want to talk about something else. There have been lots of statistics flying around this thing. 2% of Indians use, and I agree with most of these statistics, but I want to argue that human beings from a very long evolutionary span of time have been, they have they have been addicted to things like storytelling, and so on, and storytelling and conversation for a very, very long span of time. And if we look at writing, which was mentioned, and which LLMs depend on to a very large extent, what we find in human history is that writing is only, we say writing came at the 11th hour. So if we take the evolution of human beings to go back to at least 50,000 years, some species 150,000 years, then what we have to find, what we find is that we have had writing in the 11th hour. It is now the dominant form that we have, and I believe that we are in the middle of a great cultural shift where we are shifting from language to much more oral modes of production. I think that language may well disappear. But language means written language is a very unstable, very recent invention, one of the most recent. And as AI invents these forms of communication, which involve flat affect, we are seeing each other on a flat screen, and we are able to translate that into a form of human experience. One of the things that is happening is that we need writing less and less. So I think we are here at a Custer's last stand. Writing was our great, we can talk about steam engines and the Industrial Revolution, and all those things had a great effect on hierarchical relations in human society. But writing has been a dominant form. Let me give you an example from evolution and women being excluded from language. You can talk while holding a baby and stirring a pot. You cannot do that with writing. Writing requires leisure. It requires silence. Writing is speech made silent. And therefore, I think we ought to pay a great deal of attention to a shift that is occurring underneath our eyes, where writing is being moved to the side. And LLMs depend on written text at the moment. And over the past 5 years, it's improved a lot. But it has to contend with the fact that we invent tools which we later discard. Today, as we are moving to more oral face-to-face modes of communication with flat affect, that is, we are moving from the three-dimensional world to two-dimensional worlds, and then to zeros and ones, which are the language of code, we may be undergoing a great cultural shift. And we are not even able to see that shift because it is passing under the radar. And we are being told by these people who control this LLMs and so on, that this is very important. We should remember that the most important aspect of human communication, of human being, and indeed animal being, is that we are built for emotions. We are built to exchange emotions, and that is critical, because you say, I like this, I'm bored by this, I will listen to what my family says, etc. So these emotional affects don't work only through written script or indeed through language. They have to do with touch, with smell, with taste, with food, with cooking, with the whole cultural surroundings that we have, our norms of duty, what we feed ourselves as pretense. So, we pretend that we are, for you, I'm pretending to be a certain type of person. I'm pretending to be an intellectual who can, but this is a limited pretense. And we pretend all the time for other human beings. And this, so I would say that what narratives do and things like that is that they move the focus away from lived experience, this is the phrase we've heard, to simulated experience or mimic experience. And that is something which is part of our evolutionary inheritance. But that mimic experience is to do with how we exchange emotional words, with whom we bond, and it's very much dependent on touch, on taste, on smell, etc., none of which AIs pay the slightest attention to, because they are not taught that they do not consider these forms of knowledge production. But of course, they are important forms of evolutionary knowledge production, of mimicry, and so simulations as opposed to lived experience. This dialogue is a critical one, and we tend to ask questions of two sorts. One is, what is a virus? And AI can answer that. Let's say that's an example. But in the imaginative universe, we can ask questions of like, what if a virus could speak? That what if question and the relation to what is questions is the boundary which AI is not straddling at the moment. It is not meeting an emotional quotient, because it defines knowledge as written script. It is not dealing with the senses, and it is not dealing with the importance of simulations in the way in which we construct narrative. Let me just say one thing, and this is a thought experience for all of us. Think of what happens when you listen to a good story or watch a film. Your palms will sweat, your eyes will fixate, your pulse rates will go up, and yet you know that this particular experience, simulated experience, is false. It's not true. So why are you really reacting in this, palm sweating way? And it is because we have been programmed to, these simulations act for us like flight simulators. This is what I argue in the thing. We practice emotional bonding. We learn about things like falling in love without necessarily having to experience that painful experience of climbing up a cliff ourselves. So this is a very important evolutionary narratives, conversations of evolutionary training our minds to understand what it is to be human. So I would say that simulations are just as important in human evolution, or maybe not just as but very important in human experience, as opposed to lived experience. These what if questions and what is questions come together, and we are at a moment when we have to confront this paradox, because we are moving to oral modes which AI cannot handle.
Thanks, Miss. Super, super rich framing of that, and I was taking notes while you were speaking. So we'll hopefully come to the what if thing in just a bit. We have about 17 minutes, and I do want to keep about 10 minutes for audience questions. There are a bunch of people who might have questions, so we'll maybe jump to the question about uneven harms of slop, right? So there's two parts of this slop equation. One is the creation, how AI models get the data, who gets missed out, and how that sort of, let's say, like Peggy said, how certain countries and certain populations are left on the shore and don't really go deep. But there's a second part of the AI slop harm, which is how different communities experience different levels of slop because of the gatedness of their information environment. Let's say if you're able to pay for the subscription of a economist or like a journal, right? Your information environment is higher quality, And if you aren't, you're basically exposed to more slop. And I'll turn to you, Sundar. I think you sort of coined this phrase, digital global warming. You've also talked about digital waste, etc. Can you talk a little bit more about these uneven harms that are accruing to different communities and different people because of their exposure to slop being very different, right? In the same way, you have environmental pollution where some people have more smoke and more heat and more dust. Are we seeing communities and people with more slop, and what is it doing? What is the drivers for that inequity? And number two, what do you think it's doing, and what do you think it will do if this is not factored in planning and systems?
Okay, very briefly, since you don't have time, I think the idea was to, a way to find to respond to what is happening with the AI and the digital world by drawing upon something which people had taken for granted by them, which is climate change and the problems related to global warming and so on. And so when I did this piece with the technocrat who was also an entrepreneur, and we wanted to make sense of the fact that the waste which is seen in terms of climate is obviously quantified in various ways, and people can smoke, can smell smoke, and see that kind of pollution and so on. But the kind of pollution produced by digital use is so high and so invisible that we don't seem to have any, a kind of measure for it. But it seems to have a great impact, maybe on the scale or maybe greater than the scale of climate warming. And that was the idea of digital global warming that we wrote in EPW. But I think, there are so many questions about what then constitutes waste in this, what is affecting whom. And we were particularly concerned about the impact of all of this on children. And many of us who are in education know that to be one of the greatest problems as we are confronting. But, I just want to say this one small thing because it also connects to various insights we have been hearing about from all the other people too, which is that part of the fundamental problem in India is not just about what AI we are using, where it is coming from, etc., but the fact that the country as such does not think it is important for us to understand the nature of science and technology in the way it should be studied and in the way it's been studied in other societies. It is such a difficult process to set up what we call as science and technology studies in order to meaningfully understand the nature of what these things are before we include them and dump them into the society. And there it's very similar to the climate problem. You just dump in technologies without having an idea of what these technologies do, how they act in the cultural sense and so on. So why is it that there's been such a pushback to the establishment of very meaningful STS programs in the country, including in all our big tech places, tech companies and so on. I mean, institutions like IITs and stuff. And I think unless we do that, then much of this discussion to me excessively focuses on just the quality of what AI produces. Whereas to me, from looking into the context of society, I want to see how do you train the viewers, not the producers. The product, whether I can distinguish whether a product is done by AI or human, is not important enough for me. But what is important is how the real position of where the human is present can only be in the people who are taught to be able to respond to these kinds of things which are dumped on them. And therefore, we go back to this very basic question of how do you teach about technology? How do you teach people about what is it to respond to various kinds of these interventions in these new domains?
That's super important about the larger macro system that you should have STS programs and this whole AI literacy also you're talking about, right? How do you sort of teach a population at scale in systematic ways to sort of be able to discern these things? Peggy, what about you said that there's something about prestige kind of languages, right? And dialects which seem polished. And then how if there is if the counterfactual is very polished, right, then the rough language, the unpolished language does not get its due. It gets oral traditions, for instance, get pushed to the margins. Do you see something similar happening if certain kinds of people who want to be authentic or who may not even have access to Sundar's point earlier, do you think that there will be double penalties, right? Not only will they not be able to benefit from the positives that AI brings, but also they'll be penalized for not sounding fluent yeah. What's your take on that? Will it be inequitable?
I think you've got the elephant by the back left leg. I'm going to say that as far as I have been finding, every time I interact with AI, I've always thought of AI as an interesting analogous human languages with its good parts and its bad parts. And the important thing about human language is that it's living. What does living mean? Okay, let me take it through a metaphor. Many years ago, Cuba decided, the country Cuba, that why are they funding so many films when they only want 5 good films a year? Why don't we choose 5 good films and fund them? And then they discovered that did not work. That quality was a proportion of output, general output. What they hadn't understand is that the universe of films, it was not by some accident that a large number became slop. Slop was inbuilt into the model, and that slop is, in a funny way, a sign of life. So I think you're looking at it in the wrong way. So there is an illusion that most communication is about information. If you're someone like me on the spectrum, you have a big problem with most communication because I don't understand what happens at parties. It's not information, but it is for some purpose, and it obviously feeds a certain kind of person to exchange how are you and nice weather we're having and so on. What we seem to find is that in the universe of language, there's bound to be a huge amount of slop, a huge amount of stuff that is uh, can't be harvested and used, but that it is part of the signs of life. Just as in our DNA, there are quite a lot of genes we haven't yet figured out what they're for, if they're for anything at all, but they appear to in some way complete the genome. So instead of trying to think like the old Cubans of how to knock out all the slop, to understand that it's a part of the communicating universe and that it's rather miraculous that AI has come up with the same thing that humans have come up with. And I don't tend to think of life as just something to do with the carbon cycle and reproduction. Living systems, languages, I regard as a living system. And AI, when it shows redundancy, it shows inexplicable bits that came up without our wishing for them. Uh, it seems to be that in some way we are like the ants in Aunt Hillary's uh, model, where we're trying to find meaning, but there's a larger thing over us. There's a larger thing called life over what is AI, what is human language, and it inevitably includes slop. So I'm actually challenging your perception that we shouldn't have it, because you can't. I mean, if it's alive, it's going to have slop. If it's not alive, then you have to question, why have you tried to create such a human-like model and not expect the kind of things that human beings have? Um,
Yeah. No,
Redundancy and that kind of content.
fully agree, Peggy. I think you're saying that, look, any equilibrium that is healthy should have some redundancy, some slop, some messiness in it. The point we're making is that, look, these new kinds of slop are artificially created. They're not like a natural tendency. That's not the slop that's being created is not human. But the point you're
That's what
making
I'm challenging. I think
Yeah.
that your notion that something that is artificial, if it's come to life as a system and it's coherent, it's going to have some of the features of a natural system. And
Let
I
me
think
ask you
that's
a
the
question.
positive thing.
Let me just ask you a thought.
You're
Right.
determined to see slop as something we can get rid of.
Okay. So let's say if I write a script, and it's very possible to write a script in 5 minutes right now, and which gets GPT to create 1,000 sonnets, right, in 5 minutes. So today I can introduce into the information environment 1,000 perfectly written sonnets, right, about different aspects of life. Now, would you say that's actually a good messy equilibrium to get to? And if a lot of actors start doing it, or do you think that's artificial?
I think that it's a little wrong-headed that we think we control. Once we have set something in motion, it is not for us to say whether we have made a mistake in allowing something that contains slop. You have set up an ecosystem, you've set up a language model, and you're trying to still be parenting it. Look, when your job was there to create the sperm and the egg, after that, your role is finished. It will do what it will do, and you will live with it or not live with it.
Fair enough. So we're almost at time. So let's maybe take a round of questions from the audience. If folks have questions, then you can maybe just type them in and we can ask the panelists. If not, maybe we can just let's just wait for a minute, see if there are any questions. If not, there is one question that I can ask everyone for a rapid fire kind of thing. If any of you have questions, please type them in or just unmute yourself and just ask the question directly. Okay, so I'll maybe go and request you to keep your responses like super sharp, maybe a minute each. In your mind, what, first of all, is this a problem? And B, what, if you had to change one thing, what would that one thing be to lead to a slightly better equilibrium?
You want an answer from me? I can just get my
Yeah.
1 minute off.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Go ahead.
To create a AI in India that's based on our languages speaking to each other, wherein contribution can be had from the at least 50% of the remaining 98%. So we will know what we really are and what we really need. So we have to get out of this English universe, which is very elitist, and being the wagging tail on the end of the Silicon Valley dog.
Okay, great. Sundar, Santosh, Rukmini, would you like to maybe in that order? Sundar?
Okay, just a quick point. If there is one thing which I find is the greatest obstacle to people's meaningful engagement with technology, it is a belief that technology itself is not a cultural product. It is acultural, ahistorical, and can be used anywhere without any need of cultural interventions and cultural meaning. And if there is one point which I want to challenge them to think through, is that every bit of technology that comes to them comes with its own Trojan horse of cultures which it carries and imposes on others.
Thank you, Sundar. Santosh?
No, I would echo that to a large extent. I do think that that the, the thing about technology is that because it kind of encodes culture within itself and therefore it kind of unfurls as it gets used. I think it is very often, I think it is it's the easiest form of bringing about and seeding cultural change at scale. And I think that is what we are seeing. And then the lack of resistance to that is also, therefore, there is a certain free play that technology has in terms of its cultural imprint, which I do think is something that I think, and it worries me because of the fact that it just plays out in a way that seems invisible. So, to me, that is the bigger obstacle that I am thinking of.
Thanks, Santosh. Rukmini?
To me, it's difficult to formulate this 1 minute answer to a problem because human conversationalists are digressive, but that's the nature of conversation, which is why I think the Turing test has not been passed. But if I were to think of the one thing which I would like in our cultural context, I would like us to think about a paradox, and that paradox is human beings are 99.9% the same as each other. And yet culture is this great, genetically, we are very, very similar to each other. But culture is this great amplifying, magnifying glass. And what it does is to take tiny, tiny differences and give us the sense that we are individuals inhabiting our own cultural sphere, and that is very important for us to survive as individuals, as cultures, because cultures are built to magnify difference. And so we have to understand as a culture and as a people-rich culture, not to depend too much on machines, but to depend more on each other. And part of it is to increase our dialogic scope, to understand what culture does to create prejudice and what culture does to bring us together. And this is the paradox. Because we are so similar, we are more similar to each other than ape species are to each other because of a genetic bottleneck. So we have to really, I feel, really forget AI as the most pressing problem of our generation and think about the fact that we have problems of hunger, of inequality, and those are problems that can be solved by dialogue and debate and discussion. And AI is a very small segment of that dialogic, rich content that cultures have created.
Thanks so much, Rukmini. So we're at time. There is one maybe question, if I can just request Sundar to respond to this, because it does kind of talk, it's related to the science and technology studies piece, I suppose. So this is a question by Neelab, who's asking, on one hand, slop is not new, but on the other, it is generating very particular anxieties about the quality and quantity of whatever is being produced. Is slop a diagnostic of judgments around technology rather than the specific content? So maybe Sundar, if you wouldn't mind that.
Very quickly, I think it's about, to put it in a larger context, I think the question is, when we keep talking about the human, very often, even in our own conversation, we tend to talk about the human as an individual. But I think repeatedly, what we need to be focused on is the fact how we are constituted as a social being. And it is the social relationships and various kinds of socialities that really define our engagement with technologies. In other words, there's nothing natural about this technology. There's nothing quote unquote natural about the evolution of this technology. These are very particular forms of social impositions of particular groups of people who have control over society. So if we begin to understand that, then we'll be able to make better sense of what is the slop and how do we define it, and from what kinds of social forces these are being produced.
Thanks, Sundar. I think with that, this is pretty much all that we have time for today. But I just want to thank all four of you, Rukmini, Sundar, Santosh, and Peggy. This was just a fascinating conversation. And for all the super deep work that you've done on these themes, I think this could easily have been an hour long, and still be an hour, 1 more hour long, and we still would have so much more to talk to. So apologies if we had to cut short some aspects of this, but I truly do appreciate your taking time for this and joining us. Thank you, and we've taken notes, so we'll kind of send you some of these notes and then put some of this up on our channels. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.